Okay, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure having you here. This event is to commemorate the translation and editing of the book a Capitalism for the People by Luigi Zingales, and we are honored to have him here with us. I would like to thank BEI, which is the editor of the book, which volunteered to translate, which I think it's a very informative book and has many things that should make us think and debate. Not only, although the book was written for the United States in mind, but I think many things that are there in the book apply to many countries, especially here in Brazil. Luigi Zingales is a professor of the Booth School of the University of Chicago. He has been a friend of our school, for many years. Actually, the first time he was here in Brazil, Luigi, I think it was 2000, 2001, and we were still located at Maestro Cardim, and fortunately for us, he kept coming back, and it's a pleasure having Luigi again, here with us. His interests actually span from corporate governance to financial development, from political economy to the economic effects of culture. In addition to holding his position at Chicago Booth, Luigi is currently a faculty research fellow for the National Bureau of Economic Research, a research fellow for the Center for Economic Policy Research, and a fellow of the European Governance Institute. He's also a director of the American Finance Association and writes for Il Sole 24 Ore, a kind of Italian newspaper equivalent to the Financial Times. He earned the 2003 Bernasser Prize. I don't know if I'm speaking correctly the name, for the best young European financial economist, the 2002 NASDAQ Award for Best Paper in Capital Formation, and the National Science Foundation Grant in Economics. He had written a very famous book, Saving Capitalism from Capitalism, with Rajan, which has been extremely influential, and some of the ideas he still followed through in this new book. He has a BA in economics, summa cum laude from Bocconi in Italy, and a PhD in economics from MIT. He joined Chicago Booth faculty in 1992. Finally, among one of his hobbies, I read here, is cooking. So I may take him up on that one day. Please welcome Luigi Zingales.
Thank you, Claudio, for your very kind words. And I expect you at my house for tasting my cooking, so you can try firsthand. And it's true, the first time I came to Brazil was in May 2000, and was thanks to the invitation of Claudio. So I'm a long-term friend of Insper, and it's a pleasure to be back here. So let me try to explain a bit, first of all, why I wrote this book, and then, of course, what is in the book and what I hope you are going to sort of take from the book. As Claudio said correctly, this is a continuation of my earlier work with Raghu Rajan. And when we wrote Saving Capitalism from the Capitalist in 2003, our main focus was to look at why in a lot of countries around the world, some of the fundamental principles of capitalism are not followed, and why, in a sense, in spite of seeing the success of capitalism is not so popular around the world. And when we wrote that, we were still under, if you want, an impression that things in the United States were working fairly well. And this impression, to some extent, vanished in the subsequent years. And in particular, this is my experience of the financial crisis in the United States. I've started to see in the United States some signs that reminded me of my country of origin. And unfortunately, not in the good aspect of the country of origin, like food and wine, but in the bad ones. And so this Capitalism for the People was written mainly with the United States in mind, saying you don't understand the path you're going down to and how dangerous it is. And the only reason why I understand it is because, not because I'm smarter than everybody else, it's simply because I've seen it before. I always joke that the greatest contribution of Berlusconi to humankind has been to make things so apparent that are hard to not be understood. So the difference, one of the jokes that doesn't make me particularly popular in US political circle is that say that the difference between sort of Berlusconi and US Congress is that Berlusconi experimented vertical integration. So in the United States, you have a member of Congress that, and especially Secretary of Commerce or of Finance, etc., that are former employees and future employees of one or two big investment banks. In Italy, Berlusconi was cutting out the intermediaries, and he had his own employees being sort of ministries, and there wasn't even this appearance of this separation at the time you were minister. But this lack of, if you want, decency made it so apparent things that then make you allergic to any other form that looks alike. And I think that I've seen the problem in the United States more clearly and more pervasively than most as a result of this past training. But also, the thing that worried me the most of the financial crisis is I have seen a change in the US attitude toward capitalism and toward institutions. Claudio was pointing out to me a book that I find it very, that I mentioned in mine and has been very important in my formation, which is a book by Banfield about the moral basis of a backward society. And that book has been very influential because I understood how important some expectations are. So as an Italian coming to the United States, I behave probably like most Brazilians behave when they come to the United States in a very distrusting way. So I remember sort of distinctively the first time that I faced a hurricane warning in Boston. And the sort of mayor of Boston announced that there was a hurricane coming and that everybody had to go to their houses and tape their windows and stay away from the windows until further notice. And to me, this was completely news. First of all, there are very few hurricanes of that magnitude in Italy. And when there is no warning. So the idea that sort of there was a hurricane warning was already sort of surprising. But the second fact that really shocked me is how much Americans will follow what the mayor said. As an Italian, your typical attitude is to do exactly the opposite of what the government tells you to do. Number one, because you think there is a conspiracy behind. So if the mayor tells you to tape windows, must be that his brother is selling tape. And if they tell you to stay inside, that is probably a good reason to stay outside, because there must be something behind it. And unfortunately, I have to say, I thought that was just my upbringing that brought this, but then I realized that, unfortunately, these expectations are rooted in reality. So you probably have heard in 2012 there was a gigantic ship that went under in the Mediterranean Sea. And as the ship was taking water on board, the captain told the passengers that everything was fine and to go back to their cabins. And so, of course, the Italians did not believe him and took their life-saving things and went to the deck and got saved. And unfortunately, some foreigners who believed the captain went to their cabin and died. So in the typical attitude of an Italian is to mistrust institutions. And unfortunately, this mistrust is based on the fact that institutions were not sort of meant to help individuals, were meant to oppress the individual and often to push him in the wrong direction. In the United States, that was not the case. My Boston example was sort of repeated over and over again. There was a general trust that institutions were meant to be for the people. So the rhetoric of the Gettysburg Address of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, is not just rhetoric. There was something more to it in the United States. And unfortunately, over the years, now 27 years I've been in the States, I've seen this very valuable characteristic fade and I wouldn't say completely disappear, but certainly fade. And the key moment was the financial crisis when, of course, when I saw sort of the plan designed by the Secretary of Treasury Paulson, my immediate reaction is this is done in the interest of Goldman Sachs, not necessarily in the interest of the country. But the shocking thing was not that for me as an Italian born, this was the reaction. The shocking thing is a lot of Americans started to think that way. And in fact, with a colleague of Northwestern, in the December 2008, we ran a survey among sort of average American asking what they thought about the Paulson plan. And 20% did not have an opinion. Of the 80% that replied, half of them thought that the plan was in the interest of Goldman Sachs, not in the interest of the country. And what is important is, regardless of whether this is true or not, what matters in politics are perception. So all of a sudden, Americans started to feel that the system was unfair, that the system was rigged, and a feeling that I suspect for most Brazilians is common, is sort of the way you were raised and the way you still think. So might not be that surprising to you, but in America, this was surprising. And what I'm realizing is this sort of trust toward the institution in general is a key fundamental component in a successful capitalist economy. So if you think about the working of a free market economy, one characteristic is that people who succeed are rewarded. So you need to have some income inequality for the system to work. And income inequality does not go particularly well with a democracy, because in a democracy, people hate to have somebody making more than they do. The definition of a person rich is somebody who makes more than you do. And over the course of my life, I was fortunate enough to have my income going up, and my definition of rich was always moving up a little bit more than my income. So rich were always the others, not myself. And I think most people reason that way. So how can you have a good working market economy in a democracy? And this is the tension that I describe in my book, a tension which is very important and key, if you want, to the long-term survival of the free market economy. And the answer is pretty simple. The way in which you can have it work is to the extent, number one, that this market economy creates enough wealth, and so that even if you are not the rich, you are richer. So you don't mind so much that people make more than you do if you keep making more. If you don't make more, if the system is not able to enlarge the size of the pie and make everybody better off, then the system is not working and does not have consensus. And the other point, which is a bit sort of funny for an economist to underline, but I think is very important, is that you think that the system is fair. It's very painful not to come up at the top. It's not very painful not to win, but it's unbearable to lose and think that the system is rigged. And so the reaction is sort of the one of screaming. I learned it many years ago when my children were still small. They were playing Monopoly between themselves. And my son is 2 years older than my daughter. And when they were playing, inevitably, we'll end up in tears because my daughter would start to scream. And so I would have to intervene and try to figure out what was happening. And depending on the version you have, sort of my daughter, who was young at the time, could not read very well, was claiming that my son was cheating. And my son was claiming that he wasn't cheating with the rules in his hands, was saying that he was following the rules. Now, of course, he was selectively enforcing the rules in his favor and just forgetting the rules in favor of my daughter. And my daughter was no fool, even if he couldn't understand, she understood there was something wrong, and she sort of did the only thing she could do, so to abandon the game and scream. And I think this is a powerful image of, if you want, democracy in a lot of places in the world. A lot of places in the world, the system is rigged in a way that could be either the rules are designed only in favor of somebody, or even if they are designed in a fair way, they're selectively enforced so that only some people win. And the rest of the population is maybe doesn't understand all the details of the rules, but they understand enough to understand that the game is rigged. And so they reject the game. And they reject the game in the most vocal ways possible. And as I said, this is standard in places like Italy or Brazil. Is kind of novel to some extent in places like the United States. And something like Occupy Wall Street is does not make even the front line probably in a Brazilian newspaper because it takes place every day. In the United States was an important moment and is still sort of reverberating more and more in the political debate and in the radicalization of the political debate. And my fear is that there is kind of a vicious circle, a paradoxical vicious circle between the fact that there is this sense of disenfranchisement and actually a deterioration of the rules of the games. And to explain it, let me use an example, a US example, which I think is very enlightening. So we're in the March of 2009. So at basically the worst moment of the financial crisis when the United States were not really sure that the banking system would survive. And two things happened at the same time, which seems like in contradiction, but are actually quite tightly related together. The first one is that Congress voted, not unanimous, but with a vast majority, a 95% retroactive tax on bonuses received by bankers. Now, we all agree that bankers made a lot of mistakes, and we all agree that many of them got away with literally murder, in a sense, with a lot of money without paying for it. However, in a good market economy, you don't introduce a 95% ex post tax, because that's what we call expropriation, not taxation. And you know that the borderline between the two is often fuzzy, but this is not even sort of a gray area. This is clear expropriation. Now, this never became law because the Senate knew better than doing that, but the fact that the majority of Congress, at the time Congress was still under a Democratic majority, however, a lot of Republicans joined the proposal, and the reason is because of this populist outrage. Now, at the same time in which this was happening, the Secretary of Treasury at the time then was Geithner, was designing a public-private investment partnership in which basically I try to make it simple, the private sector will invest in toxic assets, and if was making money, the money would be kept for the private sector. If it was losing, the government would have taken the downside. So, and of course, this was not available to everybody. It was available just to friends of Tim Geithner and the administration. So one of the worst examples of crony capitalism were taking place at the same time as there was populist outrage. And you say, how is it possible that the two things go hand in hand? And the answer is actually is very clear. In order to maintain a fair system, you need to have a trust that the system is really fair and a diffuse trust that the system is really fair. It's like the only reason why you wait in line for your turn is because you expect that everybody does the same. If for a moment you have a sense that other people will cut the line, then being the right person that wait in line becomes unsustainable, because if everybody cut the line, you don't go ahead, you go behind as people cut the line. And so the system unraveled pretty quickly. And I'm sure you have seen episodes like this, but I've seen in Italy the Germans that wait in line very patiently in Germany. The moment they cross the border and wait in line in Italy, they are worse than the Italians. And it's like a race to who cuts the most the line. So it's a very delicate, balanced system. And this system is broken when you have the fear of populist outrage. If you have a sense that property rights are not protected, and all of a sudden somebody can come ex post and redesign the rule in favor of whoever is in power in that moment, then you don't make sort of large investments in very costly enterprises. What you do is first you get more support from the government. In a sense, you only do business if you are in the good side of the party in power in that moment. So all of a sudden, as the trust for the fairness of the system breaks down, you have a race to become more and more politically connected. The game in town becomes being more politically connected, not being the most efficient firm on the planet. And as a result of that, you're going to see a distortion in the political process. And as a result of that distortion, you're going to see more and more support for extreme populism. So this is a vicious circle. The moment the fairness of the system is doubted, then you have a race to make the system more unfair, that makes that fear validated and makes the pressure to outdo the system stronger and stronger. And so you end up in a vicious circle that lead to I wouldn't say underdevelopment necessarily, but de-development. I don't know what is the term, because Italy is an example of a country that was developed and is going literally sinking in the sea like that beautiful ship that sank in the Mediterranean Sea. And so this is what I've seen happening in Italy. This is what I think takes place, and I welcome the discussion, disagreement, and suggestion, because I don't claim to be an expert in Brazil, but my impression of Brazil and a lot of Latin American countries is that you experience a form of very corrupt capitalism, and so you experience a very strong anti-capitalist feeling in politics that instead of fixing the corrupt part of capitalism, trying to undermine the capitalist component and end up feeding the corruption component. So the leftist socialist reaction to capitalism ends up making the capitalist more crony instead of making the capitalist more capitalist and more fair. And this is the essence of my fear for the United States and the world at large. And this is my the reason why I wrote this book, and this is where I start with a number of recipe of how to recover the right spirit of capitalism. Because very often this aspect is not understood. If I want to bring down to what the essence of capitalism is, the essence is really competition, which is the part that is most difficult to swallow for most people, and in particular for most capitalists themselves. Businessmen are in favor of competition when they want to enter a new business. The moment they are in a new business, they want to raise barriers to entry to make profit. And all of this is fine as long as it takes place within decent rules of the game. When I teach entrepreneurship in Chicago, what I tell my students is, you need to enter a business when the barriers to entry are low, otherwise you can't enter. But you have to make sure that at some point the barriers to entry become bigger, because otherwise you can't make profit. If the barriers to entry remain low, competition will wipe out the profits and is very not profitable for you to start a firm. So I do understand that in business, you naturally try to create barriers to entry. But there is a huge difference between naturally create barriers to entry, which means have a technological lead, have a reputation for the best product, and so on and so forth, and using the power of the government to enshrine those barriers to entry, to enshrine that lead and prevent others from entry. So every monopoly is bad, but the worst of all monopolies is the state-sanctioned monopoly. Why? Because the state has really the ultimate monopoly, which is the monopoly on the legal use of violence. The government is able to enforce through police and etc. things that other people, at least legally, cannot do. And they might try in Sicily with the mafia, but at least they don't have the legal definition on their side. And so once you have a state-sanctioned monopoly, you prevent the benefit of competition, which are not only to, as we learn in economics, to maximize consumer surplus, but is also to induce efficiency. I am in admiration of the new Pope, but in spite of that, in spite of being raised Catholic, I think that the Catholic Church is an example of the long-term cost of monopoly. The Catholic Church, for a long time in history, had a monopoly on the type of religion you are practicing. And this was a state monopoly enforced in the most brutal way. If you go in Rome, in Campo dei Fiori, there is the statue of Giordano Bruno that was burned alive because he wanted to practice religion a different way. The result of that is that the term nepotism was invented in Rome, in the Catholic Church, for indicating what we could consider now today cronyism. Just out of historical thing, nepotism is a polite way to say you are nephews, but the nephews were actually the children of the Pope. The Pope could not have children legally, but they did, and they were appointing their children in a key important position in the church. And the point that escaped most people is that the reason why they could afford to do that is because they were a monopoly. Why? Because if you're a monopoly, you don't care so much about efficiency. You can afford to appoint a friend, a child, a nephew in an important position, even if he or she is incompetent, because the long-term survival of the organization is not a risk. Now, the Protestant church in the United States is not necessarily better from a theological point of view, but in the States learn competition. And in a competitive environment, you cannot appoint an idiot at the head of a parish because the parish will lose attendance and the church will die. And even the Catholic Church in the United States is much more dynamic and open and operating in the interest of the people than in Italy. And the secret is, again, is competition. And I love competition so much and I love business so much that I want to keep the business sort of healthy and competitive. In the United States, when you go to the park in the Grand Canyon, you see a note that says, please don't feed the wild animals. And underneath, because in the United States they explain everything, underneath they explain why you shouldn't do that. And they say, you shouldn't do that because it's not good for the animals themselves. If they get used to get food from sort of the tourists, they will lose their ability to gather food in the wilderness, and eventually this would be bad for the survival of the species. So if you love animals, you should restrict sort of handouts to animals. Now, if there were the animals in charge, they would say, please, more food and the good quality one, not the junk of McDonald's, okay? Now, the same idea applies to business. I would like that on Capitol Hill in Washington or same place in Brasilia or in every major capital, you had a sign say, please don't feed business. And the reason is precisely because I love business. I don't want business to be favored by the government with barriers to entry, subsidized credit, and so on and so forth. Why? Because while it's beneficial to business in a very narrow and short-term view, it's very detrimental in the long term. And the example is actually an example in the Catholic Church. At the end of the day, the Catholics today in Italy are less devoted and there are fewer people going to church than in the United States. So what was beneficial to the church short term was detrimental to the church long term. And the same is true for business. What is beneficial today for business is really undermining the ability of business to compete in the global marketplace. So the reason why I am so strict in saying no subsidy to business is not because I'm anti-business. It's precisely because I love business, like I love animals, and I want them to remain fit and able to make their living in the marketplace and not in a subsidized way. And I think that this is the first element that I would like you to retain for today. And if there is one thing you retain of today, that would be enough, which is there is a fundamental difference between being pro-market and being pro-business. In many things, the two ideas coincide, but in some, they're far apart. And all too often, the politician mix the two, and they're more likely to be pro-business than they are pro-market. And paradoxically, the problem is more severe the less the anti-business sentiment is present. So in the 60s and 70s, the Democrats in the United States were very suspicious of business. And that kept also the Republican in check. As this anti-business prejudice of the Democrat kind of disappeared, then they started to compete on who is more in the pocket of businessmen. Okay? Because there's a huge difference. And as a libertarian, I love when people lobbying to get the government off your back. But over the years, and this is a major transformation in the United States that makes the United States resemble more and more a developing country, the lobbying has gone from being a lobbying to become sort of get rid of the government interference to actually a lobbying to get the government in your pocket. And this is not what good capitalism is. This is not what a pro-market is. And this is what gives capitalism the bad name. The more we have business getting in bed with government, the more we have a problem. And in the United States, paradoxically, we have seen two sides of the political spectrum complaining. On the one hand, we have seen the Tea Party movement complaining against big government. And on the other hand, we have seen the Occupy Wall Street movement complaining against big business. And ironically, they don't understand they are fighting against two heads of the same monster. And the Leviathan they are fighting is a combination of big government with big business. in which they say that they are trying to do partnership. One thing that is very popular these days in the United States is public-private partnership. And the idea is that they will have the goal of the public sector and the efficiency of the private sector. Unfortunately, it's a little bit like the famous proposal of a ballerine to George Bernard Shaw. The ballerine said we should have a child together, so the child will have my beauty and your brain. And he responded, I fear that we'll have your brain and my beauty. And I think the public-private partnership run the risk of being the same, of having the goal of the private sector and the efficiency of the public sector. And that's the reason why we need to be very careful about these things and trying to prevent the temptation to intervene massively in the marketplace with some good cause that eventually go rotten. Okay? And this is the second point that I would like you to sort of bring home, that the worst things in politics and economics are always done with a good ideals in mind. And those are the reason why they're so dangerous, because they're so powerful. Nobody sort of lobby or campaign to make the rich richer or to transfer from the poor to the rich. Why? Because it's not very appealing. They all campaign with some great idea, but then in practice, we want to see what this idea translates into. And so in the United States, one of the worst things that was done was the subsidization of the real estate sector, and in particular the subsidization of Fannie and Freddie. These were done with a very laudable goal in mind, which is to say we should give a house to every American. Who can be against this? But in practice led to a lot of corruption, distortion, inefficiency, and contributed not in a minor way to the financial crisis. So one of the idea that I have in my book is to say we should restrict economic policy to take place only in the form of taxation, not in the form of subsidies. And you say, wait a minute, as an economist, you know that there is a one-to-one mapping between taxation and subsidies. So why does it make a difference? And I say precisely because I know there is a one-to-one mapping from an economic point of view. I also know from a political point of view, there is a gigantic difference. So let me explain. Subsidizing home ownership is tantamount to taxing people who rent. Economically, is exactly the same thing. And if you really think that the goal is to subsidize home ownership, because I make a story, economists and politicians are particularly good at making stories in favor of subsidies, and some of the stories have some element of truth. That what makes it so dangerous is to say because people become more stable, they make more investment, etc., if they own a house. So why don't we subsidize home ownership? And as I said, the answer, you can achieve the same thing taxing people who rent. The difference are the distributional effect. So if I go to Congress and say I want to tax people who rent, probably I'm booted out of the room before I even finish my speech. If I go to Congress and say I want to subsidize home ownership, I have a lot of businessmen who come around and find a way to make sure they capture most of that subsidy. So the reason why I'm against subsidies is not because I believe that there are no market failures. There are plenty of market failures. The reason is that I think that it's too easy to argue market failure and ask for a subsidy. And when you open the door, is an infinite sort of list, and you can't stop. So that's the reason why you want to eliminate those subsidies and affect the decision only through taxation. And in some situations, taxation does work in the sense even in the United States, even if very little, they tax gasoline, and they might tax it for other reasons, but there is a legitimate argument, which is because of the externality of CO2 emission. And when Bloomberg was mayor of New York, he wanted to impose some strange regulation on soda pops. And the goal was probably a legitimate goal. It says apparently soda pops contribute to obesity that is a major health risk in the United States. It's a major source of cost for taxpayers because of now universal health care. And so trying to reduce child obesity is a great goal. However, if you really want to achieve that, there's a very simple way to do it, which is to tax the sugar content in soda pops and let people face this cost of this externality and then let them decide. So why this route is not taken most of the time is because faced with the risk of this, the industry very much prefer to sit at a table with Bloomberg and trying to design with Bloomberg regulation. And whenever you sit around the table, you know that one thing will take place. The people who are not at that table will get screwed. That's a way you reach agreement. Whenever you sit around the table and somebody say it's a win-win situation, you have to figure out who is the sucker who loses here. Because most of the time, there is a loser, and clearly the loser is not sitting at that table. And who is not sitting at the table? It's us, the consumers, the taxpayers, and so on and so forth. So my view is I don't want zero regulation, because zero regulation is impossible and become sort of the law of the jungle, not the role of free markets. I think free markets need regulation. However, I want that regulation to be so simple that is understandable to people, like these taxes. And why do I think it's so important that it's understandable to people? Because I do believe that in those closed rooms, the regulation is captured by who has a strong interest to distort regulation in one direction or the other. And one of the key messages of my book is that the weakest lobby of them all is the lobby pro-market. Because by construction, a good competitive market favors everybody, but not anybody in particular. And so by not creating any specific rent, does not create any specific lobbyist. And as a result, in the lobbying game, ends up being the loser unless there is a popular support for it. And so this is where the popular support for markets is so crucial, because if the public at large is suspicious of the fall of the way capitalism works, if the public at large has more socialist view, then there is no hope that will pressure the political system to have a fair competition, a level playing field. And then we have the distortion that we see around the world. So what is unique about the United States? And I think that what is unique is that in that country, populism is not a four-letter word, is not an insult. In most places around the world, and I'm sure that Brazil is one of those, populism is seen as a red flag, is sort of either the extreme right or the extreme left that rise the crowd to try to undermine the system. That was not the case, at least historically, in the United States. And in the United States, they experienced a period at the end of the 19th century that look very much alike what happens today. This is, in fact, the historian called that period the Second Industrial Revolution, because this is a period where large corporations were created, where there was dramatic technological changes, enormous wealth was created. This is the period of the robber baron in the United States, and where the average American felt sort of that the system was rigged against them. But the remarkable thing about the United States is in a period in which everywhere in the world, people who wanted to address the system embraced Marxism and the wrong socialist ideas, in the United States, there was a formation of this party called People's Party that was not Marxist at all, was actually in favor of more education to people, was called the Reading Party, and was just in favor of rebalancing the political system, in the idea that in a fair, competitive market system, cooperation cannot, number one, be too big, but number two, too politically powerful. And the antitrust idea was born in that period, and later economists dress it up as a way to address the inefficiency of monopolies. But at the time, the inefficient monopolies were not well understood, and the way this idea was born is simply saying that big is bad, and big is bad because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, whether this is political power or economic power. Now, the worst combination is when you have both political and economic power concentrated in the same hands. That is what creates the worst distortion. And a good competitive market system has not only fragmentation of economic power because of competition, but also as a fragmentation of political power through political engagement, through a well-working democracy. But that's why a democratic system of educated people that understand the benefits of what a market economy is so crucial to the well-functioning of a free market system. And that's a reason why it's so important to have a public opinion that push the market in the right direction. And historically, that period in the United States was crucial in forming that opinion. That is the period of some magazine called muckraking magazines that were basically throwing mud to large corporations to expose corruption and distortions. And much of this legislation was implemented in the United States by a Republican president. Theodore Roosevelt was a president who understood the importance of free markets, also understood how free markets need some political power to make sure that they remain free and not dominated by few large companies or very rich individuals. And that's the spirit. In the subtitle of my book, there is Rediscovering the Spirit that made America great. I think that that's exactly the spirit which is so important in the United States, at least historically, and is getting lost in the United States, and I have to say, is not present in most of the rest of the world. And my objective is not just to make it alive in the United States, is to spread it around the world. The problem is that for many years, the United States were the beacon that many people look as an example of free markets and competition. But that beacon is becoming faded. And if the beacon is faded, if the lighthouse is not spreading light, how can the rest follow? And I think is extremely important to understand that. And to conclude, because I'm running out of time, I want to stress the last and probably most important point that I advance in my book, and is quite controversial, is that the notion of what we should do as a professional, but in particular what we should do as professors, and particularly as professor in business school. All too often, the attitude of academic economists is that we are scientists and we don't enter into normative analysis. We only do positive analysis, i.e. we describe what takes place without taking a stand. And that's exactly what physicists do. And since physicists describe the behavior of the atom, they didn't say to the atom what it should do. But that's exactly the difference. In a sense, when the physicists teach to the students, they don't teach to atoms, and they don't affect the behavior of atoms with their teaching. Economists do. When we teach our models, we take as a working assumption that people maximize their own utility, but in no way that's a normative statement. And Adam Smith, the founder of modern economics, will revolt in his grave if he got a sense that his followers were to take that as a normative statement, because he was a moral philosopher. And by the way, he understood, he wrote also a less famous book, A Theory of Moral Sentiment, in which he understood that actually people do have some other objective and sympathy, etc. But he thought was better to found a system on a minimal common denominator, which is to pursuit of self-interest, rather than on some big ideas that will not be then supported in practice. However, we economists, in a very subtle way, end up giving some normative statement. So I give you an example. My late colleague Gary Becker won a Nobel Prize, among many other things, because he brought economic analysis to crime. And his ideas that are now standards at the time were revolutionary was basically saying people commit crime in a calculation between sort of the expected benefits of crime and the expected cost, which is probability of being caught time the cost of the penalty is inflicted upon you if you're caught. And in no way Gary Becker thought that this was a normative analysis, was simply a positive analysis that worked particularly well, by the way, with white-collar crime. If you have you kill your wife out of jealousy, it doesn't work very well, this model. But if you're trying to steal money from a company, in general, that's a very good predictor of crime. However, what's often the case, the way is often taught in class, is to say it is rational to commit a crime when expected benefits are bigger than the expected cost. So notice I've not made any normative statement. However, I've labeled a behavior rational. And of course, the opposite of rational is irrational, which is generally not a compliment to people. So I certainly say it's smart to do this, and is idiotic to do the opposite. So what most people call moral, so not to do something when it's in your interest but is against the law, we consider it moral, right? And what we consider moral, we end up teaching that is stupid. And unfortunately, it seems that our students follow. And there is now convincing evidence that not only there is a self-selection. If you are a cheapskate, you're more likely to become an economist than if you are a generous human being. That's a fact. But in addition to that, you become more of a selfish cheapskate by being in an economic department as a result of the teaching. And there is a beautiful experiment done by Insper and others, where they sort of make salient to bankers the notion they are bankers. And basically, they behave more unethically. Now, if you make the notion of bankers salient to a non-banker, he or she does not behave more unethically. If you make another profession salient to bankers, they don't behave more unethically. But if you make bankers more salient to bankers, surprise, surprise, they behave more unethically. So that seems that maybe inadvertently, but us as professors contribute to this immoral behavior. And when Milton Friedman said that the social responsibility of business is to make profits, he actually added, very few people remember this, but he said the social responsibility of business is to make profits within the set of norms and things that exist in society at the time. So the component of norms is very important. And those norms are crucial to the survival of a fair market system, but they cannot be supported by a market system. So a market system is something where everything is for sale except the market itself. Because if you start to have rules for sales, then you end up having distortion and corruption, all the things that I described so far. So it's very important that we recognize that, we teach that, and we use social sanction for people that violate those norms. All too often we celebrate alumni who have made money, let's say, in at least non-ethical ways, if not openly corrupt way. And that is sort of our responsibility not to do so. Not only a moral responsibility, but also a self-interested responsibility. As business professor, we have a role only to the extent the business world is a competitive business world that believes in meritocracy. Because in a world where what matters are relationship and context and friendship, people don't need to go to business school. My friends in Italy who wanted to succeed in business, they either tried to marry well or they started to sort of look for political contacts. That's the way you succeed in business in Italy. And you don't need to go to business school. In fact, it might actually distract you because you lose sometimes and you get some crazy ideas in your mind. So there may be market are sort of working and stuff like that, of course, they don't if the system is rigged. So we can only succeed as business professors if the marketplace works. And the only people who really have an interest in the long-term survival of free markets, it's us. Precisely because businessmen like free markets only to the extent it's there in the business plan. And if it is in the business plan to do something else, they are not meant to be consistent and they can deviate when it's in their interest to deviate. For us, our business plan is to keep the market alive. If the market does not remain alive, our business model is dead and our future as professor is dead. So if we don't do it out of moral calling, we should do it out of old-fashioned self-interest, but we need to do it. Thank you.
Luigi, stay here. Yeah, where you want. You are, the big gorilla. Now, I'd call André Lara Rezende. André is well known, to everybody. Has passages in government, passages in the private sector, and in academia. Has a PhD by MIT, like Luigi. And has been a friend of the school for many, many years. So welcome, André. And Fernando Schuller. Fernando Schuller is our professor here, has a chair by Instituto Palavra Aberta, is a political scientist, and also has a passage in government. He was Secretary of Social Policies, right, Fernando? In Rio Grande do Sul. Okay. So, let's start, and I will, moderate, the debate.
Well, good morning, everybody. It was very interesting to listen to Professor Zingales and also to read his book that I just finished reading. I'll stick to what I prepared in terms of to comment to his book. but it's very in line what he said today here. I would say that first, his book starts, the first part of his book, the first 7 chapters of his book, are dedicated to give evidence that U.S., that used to be the land of opportunity, using his own terms, is now in the process of becoming the land of rent seekers. As he said, the U.S. is under a very dangerous path. I myself has joked with my children in some episode arriving in the U.S. in Florida, that I said the U.S. is in the process of becoming a new underdeveloping country. So I am in total agreement with his view about that. As an Italian, and we could say even worse as a Brazilian, we had the experience of what is chronic capitalism and what is a society where the rights of the right connections are much more important than talent and hard work. A society of patronage. We have in the Brazilian political thinking, the word the patrimonialismo, the idea where the state is totally captured by their own interest and the interest of those that are around the state. Well, Luigi Zingales seems to have, he propose a solution to reverse this process. His idea is that free markets and more capitalist competition are the solution. So his answer to how did the land of opportunity become the land of rent seekers is to avoid that this process go on is this was created by the lack of competition and the distortions created by government and these are the primary causes of all the problems that the American economy faces today, including, I'm using his own words, the declining of the real income of the middle class America. By this, if you read this introduction, you could mistake his book as a case of pure Tea-Party rhetoric. It would be wrong, really wrong, because the second part of his book is the intellectual part of the book. So the first part is more like a political pundit saying, look, we're going down and there is a solution. The solution is more free market and capitalist competition. But then this gives his book a flavor, kind of a schizophrenic flavor, because he presents a simple solution, and then he says, well, it's not exactly like that. So he wants to be a politician, a pundit, saying, look, there's a simple solution for the problems, but then his intellectual and well-trained economist comes in and says, well, that's not exactly the way to do it. It doesn't work, it isn't so simple. So he starts by recognizing the historical exceptionalism of the US. Say, well, history matters. So it's not only the question of more competition, capitalist competition. It depends on history. That's what we call the US exceptionalism. And he has a good analysis of that. And then at the very end of the book, he says that free market economists think that well-functioning markets arise naturally from laissez-faire economy. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Well said. Okay? But that's not how the book starts. Then he said, well, the point is that the term free market, in my opinion, is misleading. And I believed in his opinion also. What he wants to say is competitive markets. Competitive markets are a highly abstract, sophisticated concept that leads to the efficient theorems of general equilibrium. It has nothing to do with free markets. So, but for the general public, we tend to say, especially when you're doing rhetoric of selling business, you say about free markets, not about competitive markets, who 99% of the people without a good training in economics haven't the slightest idea of what it is. So it is true that insight of the Scottish Enlightenment, of which the invisible hand of Adam Smith is the most known, but the Scottish Enlightenment is in fact, it's at the root of modern liberalism. So it's John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith, and all the others, including Hobbes. Well, say the insight that says, well, not sometimes, or even most time, people that are leading their own interest have the results, lead to results who are in the interest of the common good. This is totally different from saying the efficiency result, the Pareto efficiency results of general equilibrium competitive markets. Completely different. But again, people tend to mix up and say it's the same thing. Believe it as the same thing. So, I don't think that Zingales commits the sin of making this identification between those things. But in the first part of his book, in the way he presents his argument, you lead to reinforce your stereotype. And the point is that we need to think. We need to avoid stereotypes. Because stereotypes are just a lazy process of not having to think. I have stereotypes, so I say, well, it's A, so this is my people, so I don't even need to think what they're saying. I agree with them. It's B, it's them, I don't like them, I don't even have to think about what they're saying. Well, but because he has a part one of his book very much as a pundit and part two as an intellectual, and I am afraid people would read only part one. Mm-hmm. Well, then he says, well, he says in page 240, intellectuals are also captured by vested interest and ideological justifications. Well said, I say again. Well, so Zingales recognized that the defense of free markets, or competitive markets, he should have said, requires heavy intervention, but the right intervention, the intervention of those who understand what are competitive markets. And then he says, well, the genius of capitalism is not private property or the profit motive, but competition. Then I beg to disagree. What is competition? Competition is essentially competition for power. And this is what leads to chronic capitalism and to all kinds of problems. In fact, competitive markets is exactly a way to control competition. The true genius is not competition, in my view, but freedom, defined as a sprayed, a diffused, a pulverized power in society, where nobody has enough power to influence the outcome in their own interest. But this is certainly not the outcome of free markets, nor the outcome of modern mass democracies, unfortunately. The outcome of free markets are winners, those who are stronger, and losers. And this is reinforced in contemporary world by the technology, something that Zingales recognized and have very good points about that. Well, so to get close to the competitive market ideal, we need rules. But to have the right rules, we need to have pulverized power to begin with. So this is the catch. How to do it? Zingales proposed kind of an asymptotic approach, a gradualist approach. Let's try to change things in the right direction, or more competitive markets. I have my doubts about that. I think it's good, but I think you need to do a change, to reverse that, you need shock treatment. And the only experience we've seen in modern history, especially with the Margaret Thatcher experience in the UK, it's not like that. You need strong and shock treatment to the process, not to reverse, at least to stop the process. But a point that my main disagreement with Zingales, and again, he touches the point, he goes there. I like very much his chapter on civic capital. I'm going to come to it. by basically what I think is that the human motive has both things. In the human nature, there's both the strive to compete and the strive to cooperate. There's two things are there, and you need both. But basically, he quotes Kenneth Arrow, one of the popes of the general equilibrium theory of competitive markets. And Kenneth Arrow says, it can plausibly be argued that much of economic backwardness in the world can be explained by the lack of confidence, the lack of cooperation. The importance of trust and cooperation is vital to the development in the words of Kenneth Arrow, which are the founding fathers of general equilibrium theory. So we need not only trust in people, but collective trust. And what leads to collective trust? What he calls civic capital. It's basically history of successful cooperation. So the more successful cooperation you have, the more you have the belief in cooperation, the higher the civic capital of a society. And aggressive competition leads to crony capitalism, to corruption, to capture of government, to unfairness, and excessive inequality. And this, as he recognized, leads to a reduction in trust and in civic capital. So there is a tension between competition, resource grabbing, and cooperation. And there is no guarantee that neither free markets nor mass democracy will generate the right rules for increasing civic capital. My impression is that exactly the opposite. That's why this is a trend everywhere in the world. And why? And he says on page 251, the political market is distorted by asymmetries in power and by the voters' ignorance of economic matters. Again, I totally agree. He advocates two things that I think are very good: simplicity of the rules and transparency. First, because simplicity leads to transparency. Excellent. But how to do that? How, even if you have transparency, how to guarantee that you're going to have the people who understand the right motives and vote for the right rules? Very difficult. He says, well, the media that wants to maximize viewers must provide information that is of interest of the public at large. I beg to disagree again. That's not true. The media can do everything and can be sensationalist. And if you read what's the media in England you have from the worst to the best. Not true, not necessarily true. Well, media can also be captured, can be sensationalist, provide scandals, trivia, and even pornography. So it's very different. The public interest is not necessarily the outcome of a free press, unfortunately again. There is a well-known, well, used to be a very well-known debate between Walter Lippmann and John Dewey in the 20s in the US, and where Walter Lippmann was a well-known journalist, very successful journalist, young but very intelligent, and had been covering the First World War, and then he wrote The Public Opinion in 1922. It's an extremely interesting book. I think everybody should read. And I went to read this book when I read the phrase that he had, say, well, from his book, a quote from this book saying, we don't see to define, but we define to see. And then he goes to the example of all the stereotypes and the problems of perception and of understanding. So Lippmann says, there is no truth of the facts, but all we can do is call attention to questions that require reasoning and judgment. There is no way to avoid reasoning and judgment. And unfortunately, we are all very lazy. We want to avoid reasoning. And we want to prejudge according to stereotypes. Well, Lippmann suggested that a democracy that would be that would have led by a technocratic elite. Of course, this was seen as non-democratic, and the book, The Answer by John Dewey, in The Public and Its Interests in 1987, 5 years later, says that, well, there is no substitute for the face-to-face interaction in a community. The public is very different from masses. And then I make a parenthesis here. I don't like the title of the book, and I don't like the title of the chapter on populism, even if I understand that you want to change the meaning of the word populism. One thing is the public, is the informed public. The other thing is masses that are viable to be used by propaganda. And populism is the use of people that are not well informed and reasoning, and incapable of judgment and reasoning. And unfortunately, this is very dangerous, especially in big societies. Well, I think that, to finish, I think that Zingales makes an excellent diagnosis of the problem of contemporary society, but he's too optimistic in the proposing of competition as a miraculous cure for all the ills. And he says at the end of the book, people want material well-being and freedom. This is true, but what people want at first is power, because power is what gives them both. It gives them power. What people want is to be admired and loved. And to be admired and loved, power gives both of them. So, as I like very much to quote a Brazilian author, Nelson Rodrigues, that was asked on television if money buys happiness, and he said, well, sadly, money buys everything, including true love. And so, to let competition rules, what you're going to have is not a better society, but winner and losers. Not necessarily real democracy. Just, I don't really, last thing, I finished here, but one thing I want to say, but I agree totally with Luigi Zingales, and the point is about the political process, is that it's very difficult, because when you have, in the political process, you want to show good intentions, not good results. And as André Gide, the French writer, used to say, he said, well, c'est avec des bons sentiments qu'on fait de la mauvaise littérature. It's with good sentiments that we do bad literature. My father, who was a writer, used to quote this to me, and I immediately adapted when I was young to say, well, it's with good sentiments that we do bad economics. Unfortunately. But that's part of the political process. Thank you.
I think, Luigi, we should have Fernando making his comments, then you comment on the comments together, okay?
Thanks, Claudio, for this invitation. Professor Zingales, André, it's a pleasure to be here. For reason of time, I will make some few questions, more simple questions than André, less philosophical questions. I love philosophy. I'm a philosopher, political philosopher. I love, but I will work here as a political scientist and try to make two very simple questions, Professor Zingales, that is interested to me to ask. First of all, the more philosophical way I think that you do is a kind of rule utilitarian defense of capitalism. It reminds me John Stuart Mill defense of freedom of speech. So you have to confront interest in the short time to maximize the general benefit in the long term. So this is very interesting. There's the same defense of Socrates about justice in the Plato Republic, the book 1, and I think that it's the way we teach ethics here at Insper. So do not base the teaching of ethics from an abstract point of view, for instance, from a libertarian point of view. It's easy to defend capitalism from a libertarian point of view, talking about freedom, and etc. But from a rational point of view, what can we do to maximize the benefit, the freedom, efficiency in the long term, protecting from short term interests and so on. So this is, and this is the role of a business school. I love your definitions of a business school, the church of the meritocratic creed. That seems to me very interesting to us to establish this idea. But my two questions, very shortly. The first is about transparency, and the second is about poverty. We live in Latin America, live in Brazil, have 20 or 25% under the line of poverty. Liberalism has to confront poverty to create a social consensus around the idea of a free or a competitive market. This is a task of the liberal tradition, and this is one point. And the liberal tradition has lost the debate historically to the left-wing tradition or socialist or populist. This expression populist, you know, and you wrote in your book, it's a terrible expression for a Latin American political scientist and for a Brazilian political scientist. I prefer the idea that this is an amazing idea, that to transform capitalism in a popular idea that seems a little weird in Brazil, an idea or a system that can protect the interest of ordinary people. This is very interesting. I think that your book will have an important role in our political debate in Brazil, and our public debate in Brazil can have a very important role. But my first question, chapter 15, you say that the right to design the rules of the market itself is a kind of missing market. This is a very interesting definition. This is related, of course, to the problem of asymmetric information. From one side, we have the rational ignorance of the voters. On the other side, we have quoted Norberto Bobbio, our fellow citizen. We say that information is a source of power. So politicians and bureaucrats do not have interest in to spread out information. And you have ignorance from the voters, have the source of power, to not spread out information from the point of view of politicians and bureaucrats. This is a huge problem in our countries and, of course, in Brazil. And here at Insper, we are developing a research to discover the per capita cost of a student and the public basic education system in the state of São Paulo. And you don't know this. Even the politicians don't know. I'm sure that this in auditorium, no one knows how much costs a student and the public system of basic education in São Paulo. And if you don't know the cost of per capita cost of a student, how can you propose an alternative, a pro-market alternative to this, for instance, a voucher system? So we were trying to discover just one data, but we don't know the cost of a detainee, the prison system, and so on. So, but my question, the point is, how we can have transparency? You have to reduce this information gap, which could think in some ideal solutions. We can have a chair here to discuss freedom of speech and information and so on. Could we think in an independent agency, public funded, or to open data? Or we need just a law forcing government to do this? I agree with Andrea about the limits of free press. We need free press, but it's not the role of free press to open data. I think that we need to go ahead with this question. So how could we think in the market-based solution for this puzzle? To guarantee the access to information, sound information to the public about the cost of the public sector, and to compare and to create and to diminish this gap information, this problem of asymmetric information. This is one of my questions. I have a lot of questions, but I will do just one more. My final question about poverty. You make a strong case against distributive justice in your book, distributive policies in your book, with which we generally agree. Create distortions, create inefficiency. They have a problem of rights, to can have a more libertarian argument in in this area. But in Latin America, in fact, and we studied this at Insper, we have huge cash transfer programs. In 19 countries in Latin America nowadays, we have this strong cash transfer program that creates a lot of problems for democracy, for instance. The capture of the votes of these very poor families and so on. But we have this problem. How can, from the market point of view, a free market point of view, how can we deal with poverty? Well, okay, you were against cash transfer program, for instance, Professor. This is a question. And if you are against cash transfer program, which is the alternative? How can deal with this kind of tragedy that we have in Brazil, we have in Latin America, that is poverty, that is extreme poverty. It's not a problem of the low middle class that you can offer a voucher, they can choose the school. It's the case of families that cannot choose, that cannot make a choice. They're not the logic to make a choice. There's extreme poverty. So we have some market-oriented solution to deal with the stress that is poverty. This is my last question. Thank you very much. Congratulations for your book.
Okay, before passing the word to Luigi, I have two more questions. If you can keep track of all this, but before that, Fernando, just to remind you, Milton Friedman, who someone who never can accuse him of being against markets. He was a defender of the negative income tax, which is a form of passing cash to the poor, keep incentives for the poor continue to earn money, which opposed to the program that we have now, which just give the money. If the poor works, it would lose the money that's given. So it's not a proper incentive. But Luigi, consider the United States now. Do you see any political force that would be in favor and attend to your objectives? Because what I see is people who consider themselves more populist, progressives, etc., they tend to favor higher taxes, more intervention, more power to the unions, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, you have people who it's more business, it's more it's more intervention, so on. So I mean, do you identify any movement or any representative that would defend your ideas? And the second, something that we haven't touched yet, you have a lot of prescriptions for the financial market, for financial regulation. And one thing that you apparently said, which would be simple, I think you, if I'll say, you were in kind of a favor of a new version of the Glass-Steagall. Given that the system has become much more sophisticated now, and we are seeing a growing of the so-called shadow banking system, which is growing more than the banks because of the regulations that are being imposed by the banks. Do you think that would solve the problem? Because in time, this shadow banking system will also become a systemic risk, and although they're not. They cannot go to the Fed window, but practice says that the Federal Reserve eventually can intervene, as they did in the case of LTCM. So, please.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for all your comments. Let me try to go in order and try to remember them all. So, starting with the issue between free markets and competitive markets, I think that I agree with you 100% that competitive is a better term than free, and to the extent that people understand that a key element of competition is the free entry. So in one aspect that we tend to ignore in the free component is the ease of entry, which is generally the victim of every sort of decision or every. So I think that if people interpret free as unregulated, I think competitive market is clearly a better term than free. I agree, and I will try to adopt your suggestion. On the term of the view of the people, I think this is, to me, fascinating because thinking about history, this is very much a view of historical view, given where you were born and the sort of experience of what people represented over the time period. If people are a mass of uneducated people, then I'm 100% with you. And as an Italian, I grew up with the same mentality. And to me, it was quite revealing, come to the United States and see how differently they think in this respect. And why they think differently? I think it fundamentally is access to education. So we have to realize that the People Party contributed to make high school, universal high school effect at the beginning of the 20th century. So what is the fraction of people with a high school degree today in Brazil? It's probably below 40%.
With good high school education,
With high school education, just 5%.
But let's even not discuss good and bad. Let's say simply a high school degree is
50%, 60%, yeah.
Of the workforce?
No, not of the workforce, of the people with age. At the margin, has increased, but of the workforce is less. I don't know. Nayasu is here, probably.
I think
knows.
it's much less.
53%? Oh, PB. Of the workforce. Well, the workforce has an average of, 7 years of education, right?
No,
Yes,
7 years is not
7
high school.
years of, I know. So that's the average. So that means that probably 50%, less than 50%.
Exactly. So if you think that in the United States, this by 1945, this was a fact, that the majority were high school, sort of most of the world in that respect is 50 years behind. And so I think that you can only have a public opinion when you have informed people. And you can only have newspaper catering to a public opinion when you have people who can sort of read in the broader sense of the term, not just be literate, but read, and so on and so forth. So this is really the fundamental difference between the United States and a lot of other countries, not unique to the United States. So the Scandinavian countries are in that category and so on and so forth. And also, I understand your criticism of the media. However, I think we underestimate how often the media are not in a competitive scenario. So you mentioned the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, Murdoch has a disproportionate share of the system and has disproportionate political power. And this is no British Prime Minister since Margaret Thatcher has been elected without a support from Murdoch. And it doesn't really matter whether it's left or right, but they need to compromise with him. And I think that's a big source of trouble. And if it wasn't for the scandal, that, by the way, the U.S. News and World Report, whatever is the name, in Scandal, came out as a result of some media investigating. So this allows me to link to sort of Andrea's point. How do you make sure that information flow? Certainly, having some agency dedicated to that helps. But I think that a key element in the United States is the so-called Freedom of Information Act. The fact that individuals can sue a government and force the government to release information. And actually, journalists use this massively to force the disclosure of information and to force transparency. And agencies live in the fear of this, so much so that the documents are classified as FOIA-able or not FOIA-able. FOIA-able are subject to a Freedom of Information Act request. I think that's the ultimate mechanism. And when I say the media, I actually am broader and think about academia as well. In a sense, we compete in the academic market to write interesting papers. And generally, interesting papers are papers that present facts that are novel, shocking, and to some extent, I believe that you get more rewarded if the fact you present is sort of help society at large. So identify some waste, identify corruption as some reward, both in academia and in a competitive media industry. And so those are the mechanisms that help bring this to light. Are they perfect? Absolutely not. But is a force in that direction, force that needs to be sort of complemented by disclosure. But simple disclosure does not reach individual people. The fact that you have a piece of information in some archive or even in some web page but not well organized is not particularly useful. But once there is this disclosure, then the market organized to produce the starting of that disclosure. So take in the United States, there is this organization for transparency that publishes all the contribution, etc. Now they organize on a website, they're easy to access, etc. They are having a political impact as a result of that. Once there was the information disclosed, then there was people producing it. Without the initial mandatory disclosure, you're not going to have that. So that's the reason why having mandatory disclosure and having the Freedom of Information Act is really crucial to the success of this. When it comes to sort of cash transfer or redistribution, I think that I want to be very clear that the solution to inequality is not redistribution. So the idea that we should try to equalize outcomes, like some political groups think, is not part of my views of the world. However, I've said this, and I said also in the previous book with Raghu, a minimum welfare system is not only good morally, but also economically, for at least two reasons. One is very simple, and is the fact that the ability of businessmen to use workers as human shield for their interest is exacerbated when you don't have a good welfare system. So typical example is in Italy, companies hire people when they're about to go bankrupt. Why? Because with more workers, the government will not let you fail. And so the workers are used to protect sort of businessmen and to protect failed businesses. In a system of a competitive market, we want inefficient firms to fail. We don't want workers of inefficient firms to suffer. It's not part of the system; they have to suffer. So having some form of unemployment insurance that makes sort of life less miserable in the transition is not only good from a political or humane point of view, but also good from a economic point of view, because makes it less difficult to be forced to save inefficient institutions. Then there is a point that as the system becomes more a winner-take-all, the people risk aversion will induce them less and less to try if they don't have a way to catch them at the end of the thing. So I think that a good network of welfare system, including a good educational system, public educational system, or at least publicly funded educational system, is really crucial to a good working of a market economy. And I think that this is where there is not enough understanding from a political point of view, because defender of sort of the free market or the competitive market tend to be in favor of zero intervention on that front, and I think that's wrong. Which brings to Claudio's question: who supports this agenda? And the simple answer: nobody at the moment. In fact, ironically, you see element of that at the two extreme of the political spectrum. The Tea Party is really aggressive in some elements of this. And on the left, Elizabeth Warren seems to advocate some of this element. In the between, there is just business interest prevailing, and the establishment is too much pro-business to actually be able to sort of do that.
And that's, in a sense, why I think this book is important, because I don't think that there is an intellectual platform on this position. And I do believe, I'm not a politician, and I will not be able to do that well, but I do believe that once there is an intellectual platform, people will jump in and use it. At the moment, when you try to even embrace some elements of this, you immediately corner, let's say, oh, you are against welfare, for example, or you want people, if you are for competitive market, you must mean that you want people to starve, or you are against cash transfer, or you are against this, you are against that. And unfortunately, I think that in very many places, the idea of free markets versus competitive markets have been advocated by a small elite that wanted to have no restriction whatsoever. And so this has given capitalism a bad name, especially in developing countries. And I think that there is a need, and I have not come up with a good name, and I invite people to come up with a good name because names are important, but there is not a good name for this different platform. But I think that the political debate of the future will not be between free marketeer and socialist, will be between people who are concerned about capture and people who are not. People who want less competition, people who want more competition. And I hope that this book will help shape this debate.
Shadow banking?
Thank you. There was the shadow banking. I think that the existence of shadow banking is part of a world in which one sector is very regulated and the rest is like completely free. And that's the tension. I think that, first of all, the shadow banking is becoming incredibly concentrated, which has created a problem by itself. But a separation between commercial and investment banking, I think, is useful on many dimensions. I don't think it's the solution of all the problems by no stretch of the imagination, but I want to sort of raise a few facts that often are not mentioned, because many people see this separation as simply you don't gamble with depositors' money, which is a sound principle. But I think there is more than that in the separation. One is the lobbying power. And so I believe in divide and rule when it comes to lobbying. If you have divided interest, impart the lobby one against the other, and competition brings a better system. One thing that has made the crisis possible is the enormous concentration of the banking industry in the United States, made possible for them to lobby all together in the same direction, and that they were overwhelming. Okay, so there is Glass-Steagall as a good political economy aspect, which is often ignored. The second is the resiliency of the system. So in 1987, there was a major stock market crash and no impact on the economy at large. Why? Because the commercial banking was completely separated from the investment banking, and so the two were not transmitted one to each other. And in 91, there was a recession. It was not major in the country overall, but it was major in the New England area. Why? Because there was a major banking crisis. During that recession, a lot of people issue sort of commercial papers and stuff like that. So they use the capital market in part to offset the inefficiency of the commercial banks. So having basically the belt and the suspenders too help. And if the belt are connected to the suspenders, you lose them both at the same time. So that's another reason to have the two things separate. And I think that this stuff is important and often sort of not fully appreciated.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for a couple of questions, from the audience. There's a micro.
Professor Zingales, thank you. My question is related to multiple equilibria that you mentioned in the book. You say that there are multiple meritocratic equilibria. There's the good equilibrium, in which the United States is moving away from it, and the bad equilibrium. I dare to say that Brazil is stuck in the bad equilibrium. And I would like to ask you, how would you change the set of prescriptions in the book to countries that are in the bad equilibrium? And is the United States from the late 19th century a good example for Brazil? Are there good lessons?
That's an excellent question to which, unfortunately, I don't have an equally good answer. I think it is an extremely important point that I'm trying to study, and I don't have a perfect solution. Let's talk, for example, about the corruption equilibrium. How do you get out of that environment? And unfortunately, first of all, there are not a lot of examples. When you look historically, what are the shining examples of this? In the 20th century, Hong Kong and Singapore, okay, both of which were not democracies. So that is not really inspiring. In the 19th and 18th century, it was actually the Scandinavian countries. One thing that I recently learned, which is very hopeful if you want, then I tell you the less hopeful thing, but what is hopeful is Sweden, at the beginning of the 19th century, was a very corrupt country, okay? They got out of it. How did they get out of it? I don't have complete answers yet, but of course, you have to have a multiple strategy approach. It's not, we economists like to have one thing that changes all. To move from an equilibrium, a bad equilibrium, that's not enough. You need multiple things at the same time. What worked in Sweden, what worked in Hong Kong, etc., is a combination of repression, education, and a pressure of the business elite who understood that they couldn't survive in any other way, okay? And of course, the third one is difficult to create in a country. Education is the easiest one. However, it seems that it takes an enormous amount of time. And there is this Swedish political scientist, Bo Rothstein, and he claims that if you look today at what is one of the major determinants of corruption today is the level of education that a country had 100 years ago. And why? Because it takes time to educate people. And just increasing mandatory schooling at age 18 does not all of a sudden make everybody good. Also because you need teachers. And who are those teachers? And it says, in order to change the stuff takes a long time. Now, Hong Kong and Singapore were able to do it in a shorter period of time. So it's something we need to study more. But what is interesting is, as far as I know, nobody has an answer to that. So the fact that we don't have an answer of how to move from a chronic capitalist system to a well-functioning system. And that's what my goal of research in the next few years is going to be, exactly try to answer that question.
Another question there.
Thank you. Thank you, Insper. Thank you, Insper. Thank you, BEI Editora. Thank you, Professor. My question is, in March and April of this year in Brazil, we saw the huge peaceful demonstrations on the streets where we had more than 3 million people on the streets. Among other things, we're asking for free market, less tax, less government intervention, more transparency, and the end of corruption. Can these manifestations help us to create better laws, or are we going to just create the populist laws that you were mentioned before? How can the streets help this Thank you.
That's an excellent question to which I think I do have a good answer, in the sense that they can, to the extent there is an intellectual platform to channel this natural rage in the right direction. I think is all too often this natural rage is exploited for short-term political gains, and we end up in wrong situation. I have a positive case here. In Israel, in 2011, there was a similar demonstration with a lot of people. Now, the numbers are smaller because it's Israel, but percentage-wise, I think is even more impressive than the one in Brazil. And in that case, there was a elite around, especially a newspaper called the Haaretz, that push that demonstration to break some monopolies in Israel. Israel has this wonderful image of being the startup nation because there is a small sector of the economy which is growing, which is the startup that is very effective. However, when it comes to sort of public utilities, when it comes to sort of banking, when it comes to a lot of services, there is very little competition and prices are tremendously high. And those demonstrations help to break, in part, the bank cartel and help break the price, the cartel in the telecommunication. Prices of the cellular phone went down by 90%. So I think that there is hope, but it needs leadership. And that's exactly what I hope to contribute with this book, is to create an intellectual environment that helps this transition.
One last question.
Professor Zingales, you mentioned in your talk right now that, in your opinion, Italy might be going from being a developed nation to an underdeveloped nation. And I don't know so much about Italian history, but I don't imagine that its civic culture was much different in the past than it is now, or was it? How did it manage to rise to the level of a developed nation without facing the challenges of changing the culture and creating a meritocratic culture such as the US has or used to have?
That's a very good question. I think that the answer is pretty simple. There are situations in which even if you are not a particularly well-functioning country, you can become rich. Since oil is the leading example, but in commodities, Argentina and Brazil know that all too well. And it's relatively easy to be in a catch-up phase. So if you have decent institution, cheap workforce, and open markets, you can catch up relatively easily. And if you just start moving people from agriculture to industry and produce decently in industry, the productivity gains are so large that swamp anything else. And we have seen that over and over again in that phase. And Italy lived that phase after the World War II period. Where Italy failed completely is to make the transition into a fully developed country in terms of institutions. So if you need to produce T-shirts, you don't need to have a good rule of law, you don't need to have transparency, you don't need to do a lot of things that you need if you want to be at the frontier of technology. And we see today you produce in Indonesia T-shirts fairly effectively without much of all this characteristic. And Italy for a long time benefited of that, ironically benefit longer because of the European Union. So Italy, in the grand scheme of things, was not a low wage country. But within the protected EU market, until the accession of the Eastern European countries, it was. And so it kept playing the developing countries within Europe far too long. And once we got completely integrated, once we couldn't devalue continuously, then we stopped growing, not only in terms of GDP, but in terms of productivity. The thing that very few people have absorbed is Italy productivity today is at the same level than in 1995. Okay? 20 years of no growth in productivity brings you to poverty pretty quickly.
Well, I think we would certainly have many questions for this very intriguing subject and an excellent book that Luigi wrote. But we have a tradition here of starting on time and ending on time, and now it's 11 o'clock. I'd like to thank again BEI in the presence of Marisa Salles and Tomás Alvim over there for the opportunity of having Luigi again here with us. Thank André Lara and Fernando Schiller for the contributions, and you all for coming here. Thank you again. Thank you.